The Diamond DA50 occupies a unique spot in the market, and in my opinion, nothing compares to it directly. It isn't trying to replace a Bonanza or be an SR22T, it's in a league of its own. It doesn't beat any loosely comparable airplane in one specific metric. But when you judge the overall package, it wipes the floor with the indirect competition. So, should you buy the Diamond DA50? If you step out of the brochure fantasies and put the DA50 in the real world, you will see that it is basically a 160-knot touring machine if you fly it the way most owners do. On fuel flow, think of 3 simple modes instead of a table full of percentages. There's the Get There Now mode, where you're up around 90% power, you push it and accept something in the mid-teens per hour to see roughly 170 knots if you're high and light. There's the normal cruise mode, where most people sit, which is roughly 75% power and gives you about 160 knots on around a dozen gallons an hour, give or take. And there's the stretch the leg mode, where you pull it back to around 45% power, slow down into the 130-something knot world, and sip single-digit fuel to wring every mile out of the tanks. That's how the aviation consumer test and the aircraft flight manual numbers actually line up once you stop staring at each line. But when you look at how people actually fly them, nobody sits at max power all day in a 7-figure family touring airplane. The pattern you see in the tests and in owner chatter is very consistent. You launch at high power, use the diesel grunt to climb strongly into the low or mid-teens, and once you're there, you pull it back to a comfortable cruise setting. That's where you see roughly 160 knots and enjoy diesel economy compared to a 300-horse avgas engine. When a fuel stop is annoying because of weather, opening hours, or customs, people back it off another notch, accept mid-140s to mid-150s across the ground, and buy themselves more endurance and options. Now let's talk loading, because that's what actually breaks hearts or makes airplanes keepers. On paper, it's a 5-seat airplane with a healthy, useful load and Jet-A tanks that aren't stupidly huge. In practice, with full fuel on board, you have enough room for 4 real adults plus proper bags without having to do maths on the ramp. That's its happy place. Full tanks, 4 grown humans, luggage, and real cross-country legs. If you try to use all 5 seats with full fuel, that's where reality taps you on the shoulder. With 5 big people, you either end up with almost no luggage allowance, or you start taking fuel out. That pushes you into shorter legs in the 300-something mile world rather than long 500-mile tours. So structurally, yes, it's a 5-seat airplane. Operationally, for serious IFR trips, it behaves like a very comfortable 4-seater with an occasional 5th seat, unless your passengers are light or your legs are short. Range sits right on top of those 2 axes, how fast you want to go and how full you want the cabin. On the brochure, Diamond talks about 700 and something nautical miles, light power, slow cruise, perfect conditions, and a neat little reserve calculation. In the real world, you plan more conservatively. At normal cruise, the way most owners will use it, think roughly 3 hours at about 160 knots before you're down to the kind of fuel you'd call dry tanks in your head. If you hold back enough fuel for a healthy IFR reserve and an alternate, you're realistically planning somewhere around 2.5 hours at that speed. That makes 400 to 450 miles a very comfortable leg and 500 miles doable if you're relaxed about reserves and the weather is clean. If you slow it down into that mid-power economy band, say 150-something knots on around 10 or 11 gallons an hour, you start seeing usable endurance in the 3.5 to 4 hour zone with proper reserves. That's where 550 to 600 miles in one shot becomes realistic if the winds don't hate you. If you really commit to max range, go slow in the 130s on roughly 7.9 gallons an hour, and accept that you're now the slow guy in the airway. You're talking about 4+ usable hours in cruise and legs creeping into the 650+ mile territory in the real world. The range numbers will not blow you away, but just because some planes can go 1,000 miles doesn't mean you can go 1,000 miles nonstop in real life. You're not flying 6 to 7 hours nonstop with passengers unless you hate them. 3 to 4 hours block is already bladder, back and boredom limited. The DA50's 400 to 500 nautical miles comfortable leg is absolutely in the sweet spot for 99% of owner missions. But how do competitors stack up? If we're being strict and honest about what belongs in the same class, most of the exotic stuff people like to throw into the conversation, Pantheras, PA-46s, turboprops, are conceptually interesting cross-shops, but they're not the same mission. If you define the class as a new production, high-end piston single that is a proper IFR tourer with 4+1 or 5 seats, owner-flown on 3 to 4 hour, 300 to 600 mile legs, then you end up with a very short list. In that world, the only real current peers to the DA50 are the Beechcraft Bonanza G36 and the Cirrus SR22 or SR22T with the 5-seat. Everything else is either a twin, a pressurized step-up, or a niche speed science project. Against the Bonanza, on paper the G36 gives you 6 seats, but the back two are often weight limited, so in real use it behaves like a 4+2 rather than a true 6-seat hauler. It runs a 300-horse avgas engine, cruises a touch faster than the DA50 on most days, living in the mid-160s to mid-170s, and drinks more fuel to do it. New, it lives in that $1 to $1.5 million band. Used G36s cluster somewhere around 2/3 of that and up. On missions, both airplanes comfortably do those 3 to 4 hour, 400 to 500 mile legs. The range numbers on the spec sheets don't really change the way you fly them. Nobody is doing 7-hour legs with their family. Speed-wise, the Bonanza will generally beat the DA50 by a handful of knots. Over a 400-mile leg, that might save you 10 or 15 minutes. It's nice, but it doesn't change the mission. On fuel and engine behavior, the Bonanza is burning mid-teens avgas with mixture and prop to manage, while the DA50 is on low-teens Jet-A with single-lever FADEC. So for the same family trip, the DA50 wins on fuel burn and workload. Cabin-wise, the Bonanza is excellent, but you can still feel its 1940s roots, just very nicely updated. The DA50 feels like a DA62 inside. Wide cabin, big windows, modern seats, clean ergonomics. So does the Bonanza compare? Yes, it's absolutely in the same role. A high-end, retractable touring single that can fly the same profiles. But in character, the Bonanza is the old money king of legacy GA, and the DA50 is what a Bonanza-class airplane looks like if you design it today around Jet-A, composite structure, and modern cabins. Now, put it up against the so-called 5-seat Cirrus. Cirrus officially sells the SR22 and SR22T as 4+1 with that 60/40 rear bench and 3 belts in the back. In practice, the middle rear spot is very much a child or small adult seat. It is not 5 big people cruising in comfort. The SR22T headline is around 300+ horsepower on avgas, cruise numbers north of 200 knots if you run it the way the marketing guys like, and the cap's in the roof. On real missions again, both airplanes happily cover any leg a normal crew and passengers will tolerate. 3 to 4 hours, with everyone dying for a toilet by the end. The SR22T is genuinely faster. Think around 190 to 200+ knots when owners are using it properly. Over a 400 to 500 mile leg, that might save you 20 to 30 minutes compared to a DA50 cruising around 160 knots. That's noticeable. But for a typical owner-flown family profile, 30 minutes does not transform the day. For space, the Cirrus is essentially a very nice 4-seat airplane with a jump seat. The DA50 is a genuine 5-seat cabin with the same mini airliner vibe you get in a DA62, just with one engine. Shoulder room, legroom, and overall feel are noticeably more big cabin in the Diamond. On the engine and fuel side, you're comparing a turbocharged avgas engine in the Cirrus burning high teens per hour when pushed against the CD-300 in the DA50 burning low teens on Jet-A at its honest 160-knot cruise. When you narrow it down like that, the DA50 sits in a pretty clean spot. On one side you have the Bonanza G36, 4+2 seats, classic metal airframe, a bit faster, burns more, feels like a traditional GA limo wearing a blazer. On another side, you have the SR22 SR22T, 4+ child, the fastest of the three, caps, a vast ecosystem, and all the Cirrus culture. The DA50 is essentially, what if you took the mission of a Bonanza or SR22 and did it as a modern composite with a DA62 cabin and a Jet-A diesel up front? With that picture drawn, we can finally answer the question, should you buy a DA50? Short answer. For the way you think about airplanes and the way you'd actually use it, yes, you should buy a DA50, as long as the money doesn't hurt and you're not secretly a DA62 person. Let's pin that down so it's not waffle. The DA50 makes sense if most of these statements feel like your life. Your typical missions are 3 to 4 people, 300 to 600 miles, 3 to 4 hours at most. You want Jet-A and modern diesel behavior, not old-school avgas, mixture fiddling, and prop levers. You care more about a big, calm, modern cabin than about winning the race to the next FIR boundary. You like what Diamond does with safety, handling, and crashworthiness. And you love the DA62 mini airliner vibe, but you don't really want twin-engine training, checks, and costs. And you're okay paying a premium for something modern and rare that feels done properly, instead of squeezing every last knot or dollar out of the spreadsheet. If that sounds like you, then a DA50 is a very rational forever GA tourer. So what should stop you from writing the check? I'd walk away from a DA50 only in a few clear cases. If you genuinely need 5 seats plus full fuel often, or you really want twin redundancy for regular night over mountain or over water IFR with the family, then the DA62 is the honest choice. If none of those alternatives pull harder than Jet-A, big diamond cabin, simple single-engine operation fast enough, then the DA50 is the right toy. Put everything together in a clean verdict, and the DA50 looks like this. In the real world, the range is long enough that your bladder gives up before the tanks, the speed is fast enough for 99% of what you'll actually do, the cabin and comfort are at the top of the piston single pile, and the complexity versus twins or pressurized stuff is way lower for the same human missions. So, if you can afford it without flinching, and you're not secretly planning to haul 6 or 7 people all the time or do heavy commercial work, then yes, in your world, buying a DA50 isn't just defensible, it's a pretty smart move. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.